The key card felt cool and heavy in my hand, a symbol of a future I had fought for. 6 months of silence, of struggle, all led to this one polished hallway.
My new boss smiled, gesturing toward the conference room. "Your team is waiting for you."
I remembered the quiet click of the door handle, the soft rush of air as it swung inward, and then the silence. A sudden, sharp intake of breath from 5 people whose faces I knew better than my own. It was them, my found family. The ones who had vanished without a word, and now they were staring at their new boss. This was the moment my reckoning began. The air in that room was thick with 6 months of unspoken history, a story of abandonment that was about to find its final chapter. If you believe in the power of resilience and the quiet satisfaction of justice, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We want to build a community around these stories. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately made you stronger? Share your experience in the comments below. To truly understand the depth of that silence, you have to understand the noise that came before it. You have to understand who we were before everything fell apart. 6 months earlier, our world wasn't silent. It was loud. It was the sound of the 5 of us crammed into a worn-out vinyl booth at Rossi's every Thursday, the air thick with the smell of garlic and cheap beer. Our laughter was the loudest thing in the room, echoing off the checkered walls. We were more than colleagues who shared a project pipeline. We were a found family, and we said it without a trace of irony because it felt more real than any other word. Our lives were completely intertwined. We weren't just coworkers, we were the first call for a flat tire, the emergency contact, the ones who knew each other's coffee orders by heart. The lines between the office and our lives had blurred into non-existence. A Monday morning meeting was just a continuation of a conversation from Sunday brunch. We built our world around that shared table, weaving our professional ambitions and personal heartbreaks into one single continuous story. We were a unit, a fortress against the outside world. And inside those walls, we felt invincible, protected by a loyalty we thought was absolute. It was a promise, spoken and unspoken, that felt as solid as the ground beneath our feet. I remember one night, a few months before everything changed, we were celebrating a minor victory at work, and Liam, ever the grand speaker, raised his glass. He looked around the table, his eyes locking with each of ours. "It doesn't matter what happens with this company," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "We're a team for life." We all cheered, clinking our glasses together. It felt like a sacred vow. At the time, I saw it as a declaration of our collective strength. Now I see it was just a comfortable story they like to tell themselves. For them, it was a phrase. For me, it was a contract. And it was a contract I intended to honor with my actions, not just my words. When Maya came down with a nasty flu that kept her out of work for a week, it was my kitchen that smelled of chicken soup. I organized the delivery schedule, making sure someone was there for her every day. When Liam was sweating his big pitch to the VPs, it was my living room floor that was covered in his discarded notes. We stayed up until 2 a.m., practicing his speech until the words felt like his own. These weren't favors to be repaid. They were simply the work of family. I was the unofficial keeper of our history, the one who remembered the small details that held us all together. I invested myself so completely in them because this chosen family was a world I had helped build. It was a deliberate construction, designed to fill a space that had always felt achingly empty. That empty space had a name: home. Unlike the loud, warm chaos of our Thursdays, my family's house was a place of quiet surfaces and polite distances. Phone calls with my parents were like scheduled check-ins, full of questions about career milestones, but empty of any real curiosity about my life. They weren't cruel people, just distant. My brother was the sun they orbited. His successes were family victories. His failures were collective concerns. I was a satellite, acknowledged but rarely felt. This consistent absence of warmth was something I learned to stop looking for, so I built my own family from scratch, a family where I was not only seen, but needed. My friends weren't a supplement to my biological family, they were a replacement. They were the entire structure, the foundation, and the roof. Every ounce of emotional trust I possessed was invested in them. They held all of it. And that structure felt strong, built brick by brick with shared laughter and late-night talks.
It felt permanent.
But I had forgotten one critical detail. The ground we built it all on, the company that brought us together, wasn't solid rock. It was sand. And the tide was about to turn. The sand shifted on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a tide, it was an earthquake, delivered through a sterile calendar invite. Mandatory department update. The announcement itself was a blur of corporate jargon, restructuring, optimizing synergies, impersonal words read from a script by a director we barely knew. They were just noise until the final sentence cut through it all. Your roles have been made redundant, effective immediately. The air vanished from the room. My entire world, which felt so solid just minutes before, had completely dissolved. My hands were shaking, but my first instinct was pure muscle memory. I pulled out my phone, my thumb finding our group chat, our digital lifeline. I was just let go, I typed. I need you guys. Rossi's tonight? I hit send, desperate for the familiar buzz of replies, the immediate flood of support that had always been there. I stared at the screen, waiting. But there was only silence, a quiet so profound it felt like a clue. At first, I made excuses for them. They were in shock, I told myself, busy processing the news in endless meetings. Of course they were. But as the afternoon bled into a long, quiet evening, the excuses started to feel thin. The next morning, my hope frayed. I sent a second message to the group. Just checking in. Hope you're all okay. This time, something different happened. Beneath my words, their tiny profile pictures populated the screen. Seen. By Liam. By Maya. By all of them. The word just sat there, a cold digital confirmation. There was no flurry of typing, no incoming call, just proof. They had seen my desperation and collectively made a decision. Silence. It was no longer an absence of noise. It was a weapon. And I was just beginning to understand how precisely they planned to use it. Days turned into a week, and the group's silence stretched into an unnerving quiet. I abandoned the group chat and started calling them individually. Liam's number went straight to voicemail. Maya's rang endlessly, unanswered. The final test, the one I dreaded, came on the anniversary of my mother's passing. A day they knew was sacred to me. A day they had always helped me through. In the past, they'd have shown up with takeout and a bad movie, a silent promise not to let me be alone. This year, my phone stayed dark. Not a single text. Not a missed call. That was the moment I stopped making excuses. This wasn't an oversight. It was a verdict. It was the slow, painful fade into invisibility. I was being erased, quietly and methodically, from the life we had built together. The ghosting was complete, or so I thought. The final, public confirmation of my exile was still waiting for me, just a few clicks away. It happened during a late-night, aimless scroll through my phone, a mindless habit to quiet the noise in my head. And then I saw it. A photo, posted by Maya. It was the 5 of them, crammed into our usual booth at Rossi's. Liam had his arm around her, and they were all laughing at something, their faces bright and carefree. The caption was simple: Thursday traditions. There was no malice in it. That's what hurt the most. It was just normal. A snapshot of a life that was continuing on perfectly, as if I had never been a part of it at all. This wasn't a quiet fade, it was a public statement, an announcement that my empty seat at the table had been filled with their collective indifference. In that moment, the hurt crystallized into something hard and clear, a realization. My pain was a problem they had solved by simply deleting the source. And looking at their smiles, I finally understood. My absence wasn't a loss to them, it was a relief. It wasn't malice that drove them. It was something far more common and far more disappointing: convenience. My struggle was a mirror, reflecting a vulnerability they couldn't stand to see in themselves. My pain was a heavy coat they simply refused to help carry. They weren't evil. They were just weak. They saw my crisis not as a friend's burden to be shared, but as a liability to their own comfort, a problem to be discarded. They chose the easy path, and in that quiet, final realization, the argument I was having with their ghosts in my head finally went silent. The war against them was over. The quiet rebellion against my own despair, however, was just beginning. The next 6 months were a quiet rebellion, fought from the corner of my sofa. My battlefield was a laptop screen. The enemy was the endless scroll of job postings, and the daily casualties were the automated rejection emails that landed in my inbox with a soft, indifferent chime. My days took on a grim, methodical rhythm. Wake up, apply, get rejected, repeat. I tracked everything on a spreadsheet that grew into a monument to my failures. My savings dwindled, the numbers on my bank statement turning red, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath it all. In the crushing silence of my apartment, I grieved the loss of my friends as much as the loss of my career. But grief, I learned, is a clarifying fire. After the raw emotion burned away, what was left was a cold, hard question. What had I actually built with them? Was it family, or just a fragile ecosystem of convenience that couldn't survive a change in the weather? In that cold clarity, a voice from my past surfaced, a memory of a former boss, a true mentor, explaining the one lesson I had so clearly forgotten. That mentor was Arthur, a man who had retired a year before the layoffs. His voice came back to me, not in a whisper, but with the calm authority he always carried. We were closing out a difficult project, and he'd said, never mistake the people you eat lunch with for the people who will throw you a life raft. One is a social habit. The other is a network built on mutual respect. At the time, I dismissed it as corporate cynicism. Now his words landed with the force of a physical blow. That was the hidden message, the lesson I had failed to learn. My found family wasn't a life raft. It was a lunch table. The foundation wasn't loyalty, it was proximity. The realization wasn't painful. It was a quiet, cold, and clarifying reckoning. I had spent months mourning a family that never truly existed. I had been grieving a mirage. And in that moment, I understood I had been fighting the wrong battle, looking for help in the wrong place. As if that very thought had sent a signal out into the world, my phone lit up. It was a call from an old colleague, an ally I had forgotten I had. The name on the screen was Sarah, a data analyst from a different department. We were never close, but she was always meticulously professional, someone I respected. Her voice on the phone was the same, direct and without a trace of pity. She'd heard what happened, and she skipped the hollow apologies. Instead, she offered information. "There's a senior management opening at my new company," she said, her tone precise. "The person in charge of the department. It's a significant leap, but your name came up. They need someone who can turn a struggling team around." A leadership role? It felt impossible. I had been fighting just to get back on the ladder, not to climb it. But Sarah's call wasn't just a lead, it was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I had forgotten existed. While my family saw me as a burden, the professional world, the one built on capability, not comfort, still saw me as a solution. Hanging up the phone, the despair of the last 6 months didn't just disappear. It was quietly forged into something else entirely. The goal was no longer survival. A new, much more ambitious plan began to form. That phone call with Sarah wasn't just a job lead. It was a challenge. It laid out 2 possible futures. One was a safe return to the familiar, a role just like the one I'd lost. The other was a steep, uncertain climb toward real leadership. And in that moment, for the first time in 6 months, I made a conscious choice. I stopped looking backward. I archived the group chat, deleted their numbers, And with a quiet finality, I closed the door on the ghosts of my found family. Their story was over. Mine was just beginning. The plan that formed wasn't about finding work. It was about a complete reinvention. I would not just get a job. I would secure that specific senior-level position. I would aim so high that the person I was 6 months ago would become a distant memory. The suffocating grief and the sharp sting of betrayal, which had been a poison in my veins, I learned to distill into fuel. That energy powered the 3 a.m. research sessions, digging through industry reports. It sharpened my focus as I built a 90-day plan for a team I didn't even have yet. The goal was no longer survival. It was a quiet, profound reckoning with my own potential. I was building a career so solid that it needed no validation from anyone else. And just as this new resolve began to feel like armor, the universe decided to give it one final, unexpected test. A reminder that the past isn't always done with you, even when you are done with it. It happened at a small coffee shop near my old office, a place I had avoided for months. I was there for an informal meeting, a final chat before the official offer for the senior role was drawn up. And then I saw them. Liam and Maya, sitting at our old corner table. I stepped back before they could see me, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. Instinct took over, and I found a seat where I could see them, but they couldn't see me. I watched them laugh, their heads close together. I couldn't hear everything, but their body language was a language I knew fluently. It was comfortable, easy. Then Liam's voice cut through the cafe chatter, clear and casual. "Honestly, it's for the best," he said, shaking his head. All that pressure she was under, it was just dragging everyone down. Maya nodded, stirring her latte. I know, it sounds awful, but things are so much lighter now. Lighter. My 6 months of fear and isolation had made their lives lighter. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had profited from it. They had rewritten our history, recasting my loyalty as a burden and my pain as an inconvenience. They saw me as a casualty, a weak link they were smart to sever. Any last lingering whisper of hope for reconciliation died in that moment. It wasn't a painful death. It was a quiet, necessary release. They thought I was someone who couldn't handle pressure. They had no idea what kind of pressure I was about to apply. I walked out of that coffee shop and left them behind for the final time. The interview process was no longer about getting a job. It was now about executing a battle plan. My apartment transformed into a war room. The walls were covered in whiteboards filled with SWOT analyses and market projections. The coffee table disappeared under stacks of annual reports. I was the general, strategist, and soldier all in one. There were 3 interviews, each one a different battlefield. The first was a screening, a test of my basic qualifications. The second was a technical deep dive with 2 senior directors. The final battle was a presentation to the C-suite. For that, I didn't just prepare answers, I prepared a 90-day turnaround plan for the entire department. I identified their biggest bottlenecks and designed the solutions. I wasn't asking for a job, I was demonstrating with surgical precision that I was already doing it. Every late night, every rehearsed answer was a quiet act of forging a new future. I was no longer the victim of their story. I was the architect of my own. After the final presentation, I went home and waited. The silence in my apartment felt different this time. Not empty, but full of anticipation for the call that would change everything. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, a crisp, professional voice on the other end confirming the offer. I had the job. After I hung up, I didn't cheer or cry. I simply stood in the quiet of my apartment and let the feeling wash over me, a profound, almost heavy sense of relief. The weight of the last 6 months just dissolved. That night, my celebration was for an audience of 1. I ordered my favorite takeout and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. I felt a sense of peace, believing the hardest part was finally over. I had won my silent battle. But I was celebrating a victory without knowing the full terms of the war. My past wasn't just behind me, it was waiting for me, gathered around a conference table. The ultimate question hangs in the air. What would you do? Confront the past with righteous anger or with the cold, quiet authority you've earned? Before we open that door and witness the silent shock on their faces, take a moment to like this video to show you're with her on this journey. It means a great deal to us. Because the most difficult battle wasn't going to be in that conference room. It was the one that was about to begin inside her own mind, a quiet manipulation from an enemy she thought she had already defeated. The quiet satisfaction of that night began to curdle as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A familiar, insidious voice, one I hadn't heard in weeks, began to whisper in the dark. It sounded like reason. It sounded like caution. It was the voice of my own deepest insecurity, and it was a master of manipulation. "Are you really qualified for this?" it asked, its tone measured and calm. "This is a huge leap. A senior management role. You spent the last 6 months struggling to get a single callback. Don't let one lucky break fool you into thinking you're a different person." It framed my ambition as recklessness, my hard-won success as a fluke. It dismissed the nights of relentless preparation and presented a single damning piece of evidence, my own recent failure. "You're not ready for this responsibility," it continued, its logic cold and precise. "You're walking in there as an outsider, wounded. They'll see it. They'll see right through you." This internal sabotage was a ghost of the person I used to be, the one who needed a found family to feel whole. It was the voice of the victim, warning me not to rise too high. It was a poison I had to fight alone. But as it turned out, I wasn't entirely alone. A real voice, an ally's voice, was about to cut through the noise with a warning of her own. The voice of self-doubt was still echoing in my mind when a text from Sarah cut through the quiet. "Heard the news. Congratulations, you earned this." A second message followed moments later. "One last piece of advice. The team you're inheriting has a reputation. They're cliquey, very resistant to new leadership. Just be prepared." She had no idea. Her warning was meant for a stranger walking into a difficult professional situation, but I wasn't a stranger. I was a ghost. Her words confirmed it. The path ahead was not just emotionally difficult, it was professionally treacherous. This wasn't just a reckoning. It was a turnaround project with a hostile team at its core. And just as I squared my shoulders to face that reality, the universe presented a final test, a temptation in the form of a much safer, much simpler job offer that arrived quietly in my inbox. The email arrived just after 9 that evening. It was from a smaller company I'd interviewed with weeks ago and had completely forgotten. The offer was solid, the role respectable, a safe position, almost identical to the one I'd lost. For a moment, it felt like a release. An escape hatch. I could take this job and the confrontation I was dreading would simply vanish. I wouldn't have to walk into that office. I wouldn't have to manage a hostile team of ghosts. I could just take the easy road and let the past fade away. The offer wasn't a bribe of money, it was a bribe of comfort, a temptation to trade my ambition for peace. It was a test, asking if I would retreat to the person I was or advance toward the person I was becoming. I imagined the two paths laid out before me. One was a quiet harbor. The other was the open, stormy sea. But I wasn't looking for a harbor anymore. I had spent 6 months being tossed by the waves, and I had learned to swim. With a quiet resolve, I typed out a polite, formal email declining their offer. I hit send, and the decision was made irrevocable. There was no escape route left. The path was chosen, and all that remained was the long, final night before the battle began. That night, my apartment was a silent stage, set for the final act of a one-woman play. I laid out my clothes for the morning with methodical care. A charcoal gray suit, a silk blouse, shoes with a low, solid heel. It felt less like choosing an outfit and more like laying out a suit of armor. Each piece was chosen not for how it looked, but for how it made me feel. Capable, controlled, impenetrable. I thought about the woman I was 6 months ago. She would have seen this moment as the ultimate revenge fantasy, a triumphant return, a moment to savor their shock and fear. But standing there, in the quiet of my apartment, I felt no thrill of victory. I only felt a profound and heavy sense of irony. The woman they ghosted, the one they deemed too weak to stand beside, was now the person they had to answer to. The wound of their betrayal hadn't vanished. It had simply scarred over, turning into something hard and useful. The pain was real, a quiet ache that reminded me of the cost of my own naivete. But it was no longer a weakness. It had been forged into a new kind of strength, one that didn't need a chorus of friends to validate its existence. I wasn't walking in there to punish them. In a strange and unexpected way, their survival was now tied to my success. I was walking in there to lead. And there was a profound sadness in that realization, a quiet grief for the family I had imagined and the people I had once loved. The anxiety was a low hum in my chest, a vibration of fear and anticipation. But beneath it was a bedrock of resolve. I looked at the suit, my armor for the morning. The night was for reflection, for acknowledging the ghosts of the past. The morning would be for a different kind of quiet. The quiet of precise, deliberate action. The alarm was not a sound of interruption, but of initiation. 5 a.m. The city outside was still a muted gray, the world holding its breath. My movements in the pre-dawn quiet were precise, almost ceremonial. The coffee maker hissed, filling the air with the scent of dark roast, a smell of focus, not comfort. Every action was a deliberate step in a sequence planned for weeks. This wasn't a routine, it was a final briefing with myself. As I put on the suit, the cool fabric felt like a second skin. Each button fastened was a small, quiet declaration of intent. I slipped on my watch, its familiar weight a grounding presence on my wrist. This was the silent execution of a plan 6 months in the making. The victory wasn't going to be the look on their faces in that conference room. The victory was this moment, right here, looking in the mirror and seeing not the woman they had discarded, but the leader who had been forged in their absence. I picked up the key card from the counter. It felt different now, no longer a symbol of hope, but an instrument of change. My fate was sealed, my course set. As I walked out and locked the door behind me, I knew my battle was over. Across town, theirs was just beginning, and they were still blissfully unaware that the opening bell was about to ring. Across town, in the bright, sterile light of the office kitchen, Liam was pouring coffee. I just hope this new manager isn't another suit from corporate who thinks they can reinvent the wheel, he said, his voice carrying with an easy confidence. The last thing we need is some outsider trying to micromanage the workflow we've perfected. Maya leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, barely looking up. Anything is better than the interim guy. He actually expected us to fill out those progress reports. As long as the new one knows to let us handle our own projects, we'll be fine. There it was. The quiet, shared language of their entitlement. The belief that their clique was the true engine of the department, and any manager was just a formality to be managed, a problem to be contained. They weren't preparing to meet a leader, they were preparing to indoctrinate a subordinate. Exactly, Liam agreed, adding a splash of cream. We just need to present a united front from day one. They'll learn quickly enough who actually runs things around here. We'll break them in. They had no idea. They saw themselves as gatekeepers, a formidable wall of resistance, ready to test a stranger. They couldn't conceive that the person walking toward them wasn't a stranger at all, but a ghost from a past they had so carelessly buried. They finished their coffees, straightened their jackets, and began the short walk down the hall to the conference room, utterly secure in their position, ready to meet their new boss. The stage was set, and the final actor was just moments away from making her entrance. The corporate lobby was all glass and quiet efficiency, a world away from the chaos of the last 6 months. My reflection in the polished marble floor was of a stranger in a gray suit, her face a mask of calm composure. I was met by the HR manager, a woman whose cheerful energy felt like it belonged to another universe entirely. She gave me a tour that was a blur of standard office landmarks, the gleaming kitchen, the rows of identical workstations, the quiet hum of productivity. With every polite smile and nod, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's first day. Her voice was a pleasant drone, a soundtrack of corporate normalcy that did nothing to quiet the frantic, silent screaming in my own mind. Then we turned a corner into a long, quiet hallway. and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic tap of my heels on the floor. It was a metronome, counting down the final seconds. Each step was a deliberate act, a quiet declaration that I was no longer running from the past, but walking directly toward it. We stopped outside a conference room with a frosted glass door. From inside, I could hear a low murmur of conversation, punctuated by a sudden burst of laughter. It was Liam's laugh, a sound I once knew as well as my own heartbeat. The HR manager gave me a final, encouraging smile. "Well, here they are," she said, her voice brimming with an innocence that was almost cruel. "They're excited to meet you." She reached for the handle, her hand resting on the cold steel for just a moment. The door swung open, and the laughter didn't fade. It shattered. 5 faces turned, and in the space of a heartbeat, the world tilted on its axis. Liam's confident smirk dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Maya's casual smile froze, her eyes wide with a look that was part disbelief, part raw panic. The others just stared, their faces a gallery of dawning horror. Time seemed to bend around me. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I let the silence stretch, letting it do the work for me. It was a weapon they had used against me, and now I was wielding it with surgical precision. I met each of their gazes, one by one. I saw the calculation in their eyes, the frantic search for an explanation that wasn't the one staring them in the face. I walked to the head of the table, my steps measured and calm. I placed my leather portfolio on the polished wood with a soft, definitive sound. It was the only noise in the room. Then I turned to face them. I didn't offer a smile. I didn't offer forgiveness. I offered only the cold, unshakable truth of the new order. "Good morning," I said. My voice was even, clear, and completely devoid of history. "I'm your new department head. We have a lot to cover, but we'll start with introductions. Let's go around the room." Their shock was a physical presence. They had written me out of their story, and I had just walked back in and taken control of the narrative. This public display was a declaration. The private reckonings, however, were already on my calendar for the afternoon. The one-on-one meetings were a series of carefully managed conversations, but Maya's was the one I had been steeling myself for all day. She closed the door to my new office and tried a fragile, hopeful smile. "So," she began, her voice a little too casual, "this is wild, right? We should really talk." I looked down at the performance report in front of me, its cold, hard data a welcome shield. "We are talking," I replied, my tone perfectly level. "About your team's consistent failure to meet Q3 targets." Her smile vanished. The casual tone hardened into resentment. "You can't be serious," she snapped, her voice rising. "You can't just ignore what happened. We saw you, you know. We saw all your desperate posts on LinkedIn. We were worried, but you were just so much. We had to protect the team's morale from all that negativity." There it was. Not abandonment, but a calculated business decision. My pain had been relabeled as negativity. My struggle was a threat to their productivity. I leaned back, letting her accusation hang in the air between us. "Your version of events is noted, Maya," I said quietly. "But my personal history is not a line item on your performance review. This conversation is over." She stared, her anger turning to disbelief as she realized there was no personal connection left to appeal to. I knew then that fixing this wasn't about individual conversations. It was about a public reset. It was time to deliver my ultimatum. At 5 o'clock, I called them back into the conference room. They took the same seats, but the shock from the morning had curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment. They were waiting for an appeal, an emotional outburst. They got a strategy memo instead. I stood before them, not as a ghost from their past, but as the architect of their future. "Let me be perfectly clear," I began, my voice calm and precise. "The culture of this department as it existed yesterday is now over. This is a results-oriented team. All past relationships, social habits, and prior loyalties, they have no value here." I let my gaze sweep across their faces. "Your place on this team will not be determined by who you eat lunch with or by presenting a united front. It will be determined by your contribution, your professionalism, and your results. Full stop." I gave them the ultimatum, not of emotion, but of corporate reality. You can choose to adapt to this new standard of accountability, or you can choose to find a role where your old habits are more welcome. The decision is entirely yours. The ultimatum hung in the air, a silent declaration of a new era. I dismissed them, and they filed out without a word. The lines had been drawn. Now all that was left was to see how they would appear for the morning of their defeat. The next morning, the office was a different country. The casual, confident chatter that had always filled the air was gone, replaced by the quiet, focused tapping of keyboards. There were no huddled conversations by the coffee machine, no shared, knowing glances across desks. They arrived separately, worked separately, and sat in a silence that was thick with the memory of yesterday's ultimatum. The social power they had wielded, the invisible currency of their clique that had run this department for years, had simply evaporated. They were no longer a unit. They were 5 nervous employees, suddenly and acutely aware of their own individual performance. Their defeat wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, systemic collapse of their entire world, a fortress turned to dust. I felt a sense of vindication, but it was hollow, almost somber. And as I walked towards the break room for a cup of coffee, I was about to hear precisely how the ruins of that world sounded from the inside. I pushed the break room door open just enough to hear. Their voices, stripped of their usual confidence, were low and sharp. It was Liam and Maya, their backs to the door. "She can't do this," Liam said, his voice a tight coil of disbelief. "She can't just walk in here and dismantle everything we built." Maya let out a short, bitter laugh. "What did we build, Liam? A lunch club? She just laid out a 3-month strategy memo in an hour. We haven't had a real strategy in a year." "I just can't believe it," he repeated, quieter this time, the anger deflating into something closer to despair. "The way she looked at us, it was like we weren't even people. Just obstacles." Then Maya said the words that would echo in my mind for the rest of the day. "What did we expect?" Her voice was flat, devoid of hope. "We treated her like she was nothing. We threw her away because it was easier. Did you really think there wouldn't be a reckoning for that?" Listening to them, I waited for the surge of triumph, the sweet, satisfying taste of revenge I had fantasized about during those long, silent months. But it never came. Instead, a profound and hollow disappointment settled in my chest. This wasn't a victory over worthy adversaries. It was the quiet, pathetic collapse of 2 people who had revealed themselves to be small and weak and driven by nothing more than their own comfort. They weren't villains. They were just a profound letdown. Their public alliance was fractured, the power of their united front broken. But I knew the next phase would be private, desperate appeals. And as I turned and walked silently away from the door, I knew exactly whose name would be the first to light up my phone screen that night, searching for an old connection that no longer existed. The phone rang just as I was packing my briefcase, the office now dark and silent. The name on the screen was Maya. I considered letting it go, but I realized a voicemail would just be a monologue. A conversation, however, could be a conclusion, I answered. Her voice was not apologetic. It was sharp with accusation. "How could you do that to us? After everything? To walk in there and humiliate us?" I leaned back in my new chair, the leather cool against my back. "I didn't humiliate anyone, Maya." I introduced myself as the new department head and outlined my expectations for performance. "That's my job." A choked, frustrated sound came from her end. "Your job? This isn't about your job. This is about us. We were family." And there it was. The word she had so easily discarded. The final, devastating truth came to my lips, not with anger, but with a quiet, final clarity. "The family you're talking about died 6 months ago." "You let it die." "The only thing left in this office is a team with a failing project on its hands. That is my only concern now. Goodbye, Maya." I ended the call before she could reply. The silence that followed was clean, absolute. The personal ghosts were finally exorcised. But as I turned to my monitor to get a head start on the work ahead, I opened the main project file. And what I saw made my blood run cold. The personal problem was solved, but I had just inherited a professional catastrophe. The project management dashboard was a tapestry of failure. Every metric was glowing red, a digital monument to months of neglect. This wasn't just a project running late, it was a slow-motion catastrophe, and it was now my responsibility to contain the fallout. My professional survival was now inextricably linked to the very people who had celebrated my absence. As I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the disaster, an email notification flashed at the bottom of my screen. The subject line was a single cold word: urgent. It was from Mark, the lead engineer at our primary client, the company whose entire fourth quarter launch was built on the foundation of this failing project. His email was stripped of all pleasantries. "Call me immediately." On the phone, his voice was calm, which was far more terrifying than anger. He methodically detailed a list of critical system failures and security gaps that made a mockery of our contract. "We've been raising these alarms for months," he said, his tone like ice. "Your project lead, Liam, personally assured my team that these were minor issues being resolved. But the progress reports he sent us, they don't reflect reality. They're fiction." I listened, my hand tightening around my pen. This wasn't just poor management. This was an active, deliberate deception. My personal reckoning with them was over, but a professional one had just begun. And my first order of business was to dig into those falsified reports and uncover the full extent of the crime. I spent the entire night in my office, the glow of the monitor painting the walls. I cross-referenced their internal project logs against the fictional reports Liam had sent the client. It wasn't just an error, it was a meticulously constructed lie. The reality was a graveyard of missed deadlines and critical bugs marked resolved when they hadn't even been touched. The crime wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was systemic. It was the natural outcome of their clique. They had created a fortress of comfort, enabling each other's mediocrity and covering each other's failures. Their personal betrayal of me wasn't separate from this. It was the same character flaw played out on a professional stage. They lied to the client for the same reason they ghosted me, because it was easier than facing a difficult truth. The realization landed with a quiet, chilling force. I now held the undeniable digital proof of their shared deception. The evidence was absolute, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the architect of that lie realized he had nowhere left to hide. The knock on my office door the next morning was hesitant, a stark contrast to the bravado Liam had always projected. When I told him to come in, he entered not as a colleague, but as a man who had reached the end of his rope. His shoulders were slumped, the confidence completely drained from his face. He didn't sit until I gestured to the chair. He stared at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. "The project is a disaster," he said, his voice quiet and hollow. "I know you've seen the real numbers." I kept telling myself we could fix it, that we could catch up before anyone noticed. But the pressure, it just kept building. This was his professional surrender. A quiet, defeated admission that he was out of his depth. I said nothing. I just listened, letting the silence of the office amplify the weight of his confession. He wasn't apologizing for what he did to me. He was confessing his own professional ruin. Then he finally looked up, his eyes searching for an ally, for a deal. "It wasn't just me," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Maya was supposed to handle the security audits. She kept signing off on them, but she never ran the tests. I can show you the server logs. I can prove it." And there it was, the final, pathetic act. To save himself, he was willing to sacrifice the very person he had built his fortress around. He was handing me the first stone to throw at their crumbling alliance. Liam's offer to betray Maya was a confession I never had to use. Because later that afternoon, as I walked past their section of the open plan office, I heard the sound of their alliance finally breaking. Their voices were low, but sharp with the jagged edges of panic. It was Maya. "You went to her office. You threw me under the bus to save yourself. Liam's reply was stripped of all its former bravado. It was the cold, flat sound of pure self-preservation. It's every person for themselves now, Maya. You should know that better than anyone. You didn't do the work. Did you expect me to take the fall for you? There was a long silence. Then Maya's voice, barely a whisper, but filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. I expected the friend who promised we were a team for life wouldn't be the one to hand them the knife. That was before, Liam shot back. This is business. I kept walking, not needing to hear any more. The great found family was dead. Not by my hand, but by its own internal rot. They had built their world on the quicksand of convenience, and under the first real pressure, it had swallowed them whole. Their alliance was officially broken. The fortress had fallen from within, and with their foundation shattered, all that was left was to enact the consequences, to watch the individual dominoes begin to fall. My decisions were not born from anger, but from the cold, hard data of the project's failure. They were the unavoidable consequences of their own choices, delivered with the quiet, impersonal authority of my new role. The first domino was Liam. I didn't need to fire him. I simply compiled the internal project logs alongside the falsified reports he'd sent to the client and forwarded the package to Human Resources with a single question. Can you please advise on corporate protocol for this discrepancy? An official investigation was launched immediately. He was placed on administrative leave, his network access revoked before he'd finished his morning coffee. He was no longer my problem. He was a liability the company had to formally address. His fate was sealed by his own lies. The second was Maya. For her, I drafted a performance improvement plan. It was a precise, unforgiving document outlining the exact security protocols she had neglected, with weekly benchmarks she would have to meet personally. There would be no more delegating, no more signing off on work that was never done. It was a path to redemption, paved with the accountability she had always avoided. It gave her a choice: prove her competence or document her own exit. The others were reassigned. The clique was surgically dismantled. I moved one to a junior role that better reflected his actual contributions, stripping him of a title he had clearly never earned. Another was transferred to a different team, an island where she would have to survive on her own merit, not her social connections. The comfort they had built their careers on was gone. They were no longer a unit. They were just employees, facing the direct, professional consequences of their collective negligence. The old structure was completely demolished. The dead weight was cut away. What remained was a collection of fractured individuals, stripped of their power and waiting for the final blow. But in that professional silence, I made one last decision. I wasn't just there to deliver consequences. I was there to build a successful team. And that meant offering them something they never offered me: a chance to earn their redemption. A final gift they never saw coming. The project began to turn around. The remaining team, stripped of their social crutches, started to work. The red on the dashboard slowly turned to green, one metric at a time. 2 months later, in the project postmortem, the client was celebrating a successful launch. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before my team and gave them full public credit for the turnaround. I highlighted their individual contributions, including Maya's now flawless security reports. It was my final gift. Not forgiveness, but professional grace. The ultimate revenge wasn't watching them fail, but demonstrating a standard of leadership they couldn't comprehend. I gave them the chance to rebuild their careers. But this shared victory created a dangerous illusion for some, a belief that our professional success could somehow mend a personal wound that was now beyond repair. A week after the post-mortem, Maya caught me by the elevators. Her expression was a careful blend of hope and nervousness. "That was a hell of a win," she started, falling into step beside me. "Felt like old times, didn't it?" Us against the world. The words were a fragile bridge, extended over a canyon of betrayal, leading back to a past I had no intention of revisiting. We stopped in the vast, quiet lobby. I turned to face her, not as a boss, but as a person drawing a final, necessary line in the sand. "Maya," I said, my voice calm and precise, completely free of the anger that had once fueled me. "You did excellent work on the security protocols. Your contributions were critical to the project's success, and I genuinely appreciate your professionalism." Her face brightened, mistaking professional acknowledgement for personal absolution. "I knew you'd see that," she said, a wave of relief in her voice. "I was hoping maybe we could get a drink? Talk about everything. As we once did." This was the moment. The final test. "I appreciate the offer," I replied, my tone gentle but absolute. "But our relationship is and will remain professional. I wish you nothing but the best in your career here." I mean that. The hope in her eyes didn't just flicker. It was extinguished. There was no argument, no last desperate appeal. She just gave a small, defeated nod and turned away. Watching her walk through the revolving glass doors, I didn't feel a sting of victory. I felt serene. The final ghost had been peacefully laid to rest. Closing that door wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of profound self-respect. It was the final clearing of the wreckage, making space for the quiet work of rebuilding, not a team, but a life. The work of reconciling not with them, but with the quiet, resilient person I had finally found within myself. From my office window, the city was a sprawling map of light, each point a life, a story, completely separate from my own. For years, I had believed my strength was a collective thing, something borrowed from the warmth of a shared table and the echo of laughter in a crowded room. I had built my identity on the fragile foundation of a found family, a structure that collapsed the moment it was tested. The 6 months of silence they gave me was a cruel gift. It forced me into the quiet, desolate space where I had to confront the person I was when no one else was there. The pain of their abandonment never truly vanished. It became a part of my architecture, like steel reinforcing concrete. It taught me that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about learning to be your own safety net. My victory wasn't the look on their faces in that conference room. It wasn't the power I now held over their careers. Those were just chapters in a story that was ultimately not about them at all. The real reconciliation was with the woman reflected in the dark glass before me, the one who had weathered the storm and learned to navigate by her own stars. The loss of my friends was a profound and painful reckoning, but it led me to a far more profound realization. The family I thought I needed was a mirror, reflecting a strength I didn't yet know I possessed. The strongest foundations are not the ones we find in others, but the ones we quietly build within ourselves. After everything she went through, was that final meeting an act of self-respect or the coldest revenge imaginable? Tell me your honest opinion in the comments. I read and reply to every single one. In the next video, we'll see this exact pattern repeat, but this time it's not with friends, it's with family. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what happens when they come begging. Like, if you understand the real lesson here, and share this with someone who needs to see the truth.